What is up, everybody? It is JJ Buckets here, and today I am joined by the Waraich Report. I'm sorry, I'm going to jump through a little bit of the formalities here because we got a good topic and we got a lot to talk about, so there's not a lot of time to waste here, but just make sure you're not subscribing to me and liking this video. Make sure you head over to the Waraich Report. He recently just dropped a similar video to this, and I actually made a point of not watching it because I didn't want a cheat sheet as to what you were going to talk about here today, but rest assured, I will get around to watching it. Bored. But yeah, we are going to talk about the Raptors playoff series with the Sixers. Of course, we are. It's the hot topic of the day. The Raptors are here. The Raptors are better than advertised, as I talked about in my last video. And frankly, I think the Raptors have a good chance to win this series. So we are going to talk the strengths, weaknesses, X factors, and then series predictions here. So let's lead things off with the strengths. I'm going to kick us off here if that's okay with you, Waraich. So, big strength that I actually think the Raptors have in this series, and this is going to be a bit of a hot take, but it's one that I stand very firmly by. I think Doc Rivers has been a little overrated as a coach for a while now. And honestly, I'm looking at that coaching matchup between Nick Nurse and Doc Rivers. And man, am I really liking our odds? I think Nick Nurse, with all due respect to Doc, who's obviously a former championship winning coach, I think Nick Nurse is going to coach circles around Doc Rivers in this series, in my personal opinion. I think he's better at scheming. I think he's better with his rotations. I think he's like some of the lineups that he puts up there are very unique and I think very suited to playoff basketball, where I think you're going to look for like particular lineups to exploit certain mismatches and stuff like that. I think Nick Nurse, quite frankly, is going to be coaching circles around Doc Rivers this entire series. And I think that's easily going to be one of the biggest strengths for the Raptors in this one. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. I always talk about Doc Rivers, even that championship he won with the Celtics. I think it's fair to say he should have had at least two or three. The Celtics team was absolutely stacked. And a lot of people say this, that Celtics team carried him to that championship. If not for that team, he wouldn't have had championships. This is something, and like you said, it's probably a good thing you didn't watch my video because this was one of the things I had mentioned as well. I feel like Doc Rivers is a great regular season coach. We see a lot of that with the NBA coaches. They're great in the regular season, but when it comes to playoffs and strategizing their offensive and defensive schemes, Doc Rivers definitely struggles against that. So I think he is one of those coaches that is very overrated. Not a little. I'm going to take it a next step and say he's very overrated in the sense that everyone kind of just views his record during the regular season and thinks he's a great coach, but he's blown multiple, I believe it's 3-1 leads in his career as a coach. And he's failed time and time again with that Clippers roster, who I think was very talented with Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan several years ago. And I thought they should have at least made at least one finals. But again, I think Doc Rivers is a little bit underrated. And Nick Nurse, as us Raptors fans know very well, he's an absolute mad scientist. He does so many things well, not only on the defensive side, but he's not afraid to try new things, which makes him a really good coach. And I think that's something as fans don't appreciate enough, because a lot of coaches are kind of just stuck in their ways. And we saw this with Dwayne Casey. His adjustments were absolutely terrible in the playoffs. And I think that is what has changed ever since we obviously have Nick Nurse as a head coach. So I absolutely have to agree with you in the sense that Nick Nurse is going to be running circles around Doc Rivers. And this is going to be fun to see.
Funny enough, you actually touched upon something that I was going to get back to as well, is I think Nick Nurse is so fantastic at just making adjustments and kind of playing the matchup, and then like again, never really afraid to explore some lineups that other coaches maybe would see as a little unconventional. So I think in that regard, like while Nurse is going to be making adjustments throughout this series, I think Rivers is really going to struggle to keep up. So I like our coach in this fight, and I think he's honestly going to be one of the biggest strengths here. But what do you think? What do you have as a major strength for the Raptors heading into the series?
Now, for me, I think personally, the Raptors' ability to expose some of the 76ers defenders, really exploit them in mismatches and different matchups, you'll see, because we know the Raptors have every player essentially in their starting lineup of Scotty, Pascal, OG, Fred, and Gary Trent Jr., who are able to get their own points. And this is going to be fun because obviously we know James Harden's defense is questionable at best. Of course, then they have Tyrese Maxey, who I haven't seen enough of, to be honest, to really comment on his defense. But Tobias Harris is another player I don't necessarily be seen as a really good defender. So now you have three guys out of your starting five who aren't great defenders. And if they decide to put Joel Embiid in a pick and roll or decide to put him on Pascal Siakam, that's not a favorable matchup for the 76ers. Pascal Siakam is much faster. He has the foot speed, and Joel Embiid isn't necessarily that player that can keep up with Pascal. So I think that is going to be a major strength and one thing they definitely need to expose during this series.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you there. The one thing that I like about this series is obviously a lot of talk has been made about the fact that Matisse Thybulle can't play games 3 and 4, in Canada because he can't travel over the border because he's unvaccinated, which is really stupid because, the Raptors have to deal with that all the time anyways, because they have the same thing going into the States. They have to be vaccinated to cross the border, which all the Raptors are. Anyways, politics aside, not having Matisse Thybulle, I think for games 3 and 4, which in theory, I'd say is probably one of the guys that you'd like to throw on Pascal Siakam, is really going to be great for Pascal and for his chances of just having a big game. Because I'm kind of with you, don't get me wrong, Joel is a fantastic defender, but if you're going to give me Pascal kind of, cooking in that mid range, trying to create his own shot where he's obviously gotten a lot better this year against Joel Embiid, just one-on-one in space, I actually don't hate that. Like down low, don't get me wrong, as a defender, Joel Embiid is a monster, but if you're kind of taking him out of, like, the further you take him out of that paint, like, I'm not saying he's a liability by any means, but the further you're taking him out of that paint, the more I think Pascal actually doesn't have a bad matchup there at all. And again, like those games 3 and 4 where you're not even going to have Thibault either, I think this is a series where I could really see, kind of like you're saying with exploiting the mismatches, where I could actually really see a good series for Pascal Siakam, and it will obviously really feed into the Pascal All NBA crowd and like how hyped they're going to be. Pascal's obviously had a great season. He's been the best player for the Raptors, and I think this is a series where, like you're talking about with the mismatches, he really has a chance to show how good he's been this year, and the fact that obviously this has been the best pro season of his career.
I agree. I think I've mentioned this in my video. I don't think the 76ers have a player that is capable of defending Pascal in terms of foot speed, in terms of size, in terms of his, ability to do spin moves. I know everyone has made fun of that, but he'll put him in a spin cycle. He'll put Joel Embiid in a spin cycle. We've seen that on several positions on one-on-one. So I agree. This is Pascal Siakam series. I know it's not a revenge series because we're not playing the Celtics, but it's his chance to really shine because he really struggled the last time around in the playoffs. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on to the weaknesses here. So this is a weird one for me because in my notes here, I have Joel Embiid versus small ball. And on one hand, like, I really don't hate that matchup per se, because like we've seen it, that the Raptors are just going to throw multiple defenders at Embiid and they're going to try to get the ball out of his hands. But I think I'd be disingenuous if I didn't at least mention the fact that, we're playing an MVP caliber player and we don't really have that traditional, like, I don't know if traditional center is the thing. And oh my goodness, my dog is barking in the background right now. Folks, please try to drown it out. I know it's going to be a little loud. I'm sorry. She's a big barker. Yeah. So I don't necessarily hate it, but at the same time, I do think there is room for Embiid to really exploit that at times. And I know the Raptors are going to scheme against it, and I think they'll give a chance to anybody else to beat them, but my goodness, dog. But there's still going to be moments where I think Embiid is probably going to get a lot of scoring down low and really take it to the Raptors.
By the way, you haven't heard my dog bark, and that's a good thing because the whole house just vibrates. She's a very large dog who continuously barks at my neighbors. So let's just hope my dog doesn't go off here. So I think personally, the issue that really worries about me, and I agree with the small ball lineup, is the fact that the Raptors will have to throw multiple bodies at Joel Embiid. Obviously, they don't have one player that can guard him one-on-one because he's physically too strong. And just the fact that the Raptors don't have anyone over 6'9". So that's going to be a huge problem in terms of when the Raptors are in a close game and you're winding down to the last 2 minutes of the game. You obviously have to throw multiple bodies at Joel Embiid in the paint, but then you also have to guard James Harden. And ultimately, I think you're going to leave some guys open on the perimeter. So I think that's a big issue. We've seen that with multiple teams, not only with 76ers, but the Raptors don't have that physical presence in the paint. And that makes it a little bit more challenging. So I'd have to agree with you in terms of weaknesses. That does worry me a lot in terms of when it comes down to grabbing that crucial rebound you really need in the last, let's say, 30 seconds of the game. So that's going to be really difficult to do. And again, it's you ultimately have to going to leave a few players open on the 76ers because there you can only guard so many players at one time. So I think that is going to be a big issue for the Raptors going into the series.
Okay. And as far as things go for you, what do you see as the big weakness for the Raptors here?
Now, a lot of people may disagree with this. Personally, I think the Raptors' half-court offense is what worries me at times. I know they have five guys that are capable of getting their own basket, but once the game slows down and when they are set defenses, I think the Raptors aren't able to get points as easily because it's not transition. You're not attacking the basket and kicking it out to the three-pointer because, well, the defenders are right there. So I think that is one concern for me personally of once the game slows down, once the Raptors aren't running in transition, how are they going to get points? And if they're going to be able to score just as well as they have been during the season. So that's, again, it's those last few minutes of the game that really worries me in terms of how they're going to be able to get those points and score in half-court offenses. So
See, that's an interesting one because I actually don't necessarily agree. I'm just pulling up the pace stats right now because I do remember talking about this recently. There we go. So Toronto has actually had the 25th ranked pace in the NBA this season at 98.6. So they are actually one of the slowest teams in regards there, and have been all season long, which is funny to me because I think at the, in the off season when I kind of like saw this team coming together, I would have figured that they would actually be on the other end of that and they would be a team that would get a lot of their points in transition. But they haven't. They've been surprisingly good, I think, in creating shots for them, like good looks and creating shots for everybody in those half court sets. And it's one of the things that I actually really like about this team heading into the playoffs this year, where, like, sure, you don't have that like talent that kind of jumps at you like a Kawhi Leonard, to immediately like take over the game on the perimeter, or like, I don't know, it's just some other examples like a Steph Curry, a LeBron James, a Luka Doncic, whatever name you want to throw out there. I know there's not that immediate name there that hops out at you, but I think collectively as a unit, this team has been better than anticipated in regards to playing in these, I guess, in these sets and in these environments and styles of play that kind of do remind me of playoff basketball. So I guess to better phrase it, I think the Raptors have been playing a playoff basketball type of style all year long. And I actually don't hate how they can translate that over to the playoffs personally.
yeah, I don't know. I'd still disagree. I'm actually surprised that their pace is so slow. I'd figure because they obviously get a lot of their points in transitions. They're a team that love to run, and they have a lot of guys that can run. So I'm actually really surprised to hear that. But for me personally, I know obviously Pascal is able to create his own shot, but he is somewhat limited offensively. Then of course we have Scotty Barnes, who has actually surprised a lot of people in terms of him shooting that 3-point ball, but he lives in the paint as well. And then you have Fred VanVleet and Gary Trent Jr., who struggle to finish at the basket. And then OG Anunoby, the big question with him always is how many shots is he going to get and whether or not he's actually going to be aggressive looking for his own points. Oftentimes you'll see him just pass up shots even when he has the ball. So again, that's what really worries me. But again, we'll wait and see. It's one of those things. What maybe the Raptors do surprise us. We don't know what happens in the playoffs. Anything can happen. That is just something I think might be a concerning issue for me as a Raptors fan, but let's see what happens.
And speaking of surprises, this is actually a great segue. Let's talk X factors. Let's talk X factors for this series. So obviously X factors are things that can swing one way or the other. And I'm going to lead us off here. So this is a player that a few years ago, I think would have been sacrilegious to include in the X Factors section because you knew what you were going to get out of him. You knew you were going to get superstar level production from like one of the top 5 best players on the planet type of production. But this year, I struggle. Part of me thinks it's a little bit of the hamstring, but the other part of me is like, man, maybe he's just hit that age and he's just not the guy that he used to be anymore. Whatever the case is, I think James Harden is honestly a massive X factor for this series. A lot of people kind of thought that with the change of scenery with Philly and it being potentially a better fit there, that Harden would kind of capture a bit of his old form back. And at first that kind of seemed to be true, but then as things have gone along, he just hasn't looked like the James Harden we kind of know he can be from the past few years. Especially he's definitely far removed from that offensive juggernaut that he was in Houston, but even with that, he's even, I'd say, worse than, say, even the James Harden last year that was on the Brooklyn Nets. It's just, it's weird. It's very weird to me to include James Harden in the X Factors section because, again, like a guy that's been a top five player kind of, or has, it's felt like he's been a top five player in the league for so long that's just like, now seeing that drop off, like he could really swing this series one way or the other. Like a great series from James Harden and the Raptors are out in like five. A bad series from James Harden and the Raptors might be pulling off the upset.
Well, wait a second. I'm going to disagree with you on there. Even if James Harden has a really good series, I don't think this is ending in five. Come on, JJ. Come on, JJ.
Hey man, I'm just throwing out the first things that come to my head. That's not actually a quote me on that prediction type of thing. But no, like, I mean, a great series from Harden, and obviously Philly's chances are way better than they are with Harden kind of looking like the old man that he's kind of shown of late.
I agree. I agree. And I think here's the thing. I have never really thought about this when talking about James Harden. And it was one of those things. It just clicked into my mind right now as well. But the Phillies, we talked about the Raptors bench not being great. And obviously the benches don't really play that much in the playoffs anyways. But the 76ers don't have a great bench either. So James Harden is obviously going to be expected to play 40 plus minutes a game. And how's the hamstring going to hold up? That's a big question. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, he's 32 years old. Is he not 31, 32?
Let's do a quick fact check on that, but I believe you're just about on the ball.
He's turning
You nailed
32.
it. He is 32 years old.
So there you go. That's normally when you see star players declining a little bit and you see less and less of them being as productive. I think with James Harden, what has really happened is that he's focused less on scoring and more of passing. As we've seen against the Raptors, I believe he's averaging in the two games as the 76ers, he's played the Raptors. He's averaging 11 and a half assists, which is amazing for him. But then
And
he's
so,
only,
I was going to say,
that's
ends up god awful shooting numbers too.
he is. I believe it's 35%, 33%, somewhere around that range where he's averaging versus the Raptors, and he's only scoring 15 points a game in those two games. So, I mean, if the Raptors can limit his offense in terms of scoring, that would be amazing because then the load just kind of moves from James Harden. I mean, I know Joel Embiid is the player that's really dominating the whole league right now, but it really shifts from, expecting James Harden to score to really Joel Embiid having to carry the 76ers. And that's going to be a big, if X factor, because if James Harden is scoring 15, 20 points a game, you're expecting Embiid to drop 30, 35 a night. And that's going to be asking a lot because we know the Raptors, obviously coaching staff does a very good job of guarding Joel Embiid, even though we don't have obviously a Marcus Gasol anymore. But I think it's very much dependent on James Harden and how he produces this playoff series.
I saw this tweet, I think it was the other day, where somebody was saying that the Raptors should sign Marcus Gasol to a contract just so he can sit on the end of the bench and mentally just mess with
Torture.
Joel Embiid.
That'd be amazing. Bring him on our coaching staff or something, But no, that is, I'd have to agree with you here. But personally, when we're talking about X factors for me from the Raptors' point of view, I think it's Gary Trent Jr. We're going to need his 3-point shooting, especially Fred dealing with that knee issue as well. But I think OG Anunoby is going to be a great 3-point shooter, but I should say Gary Trent Jr. is really going to be between the third and second option on offense in terms of Raptors because Pascal is going to do his thing. We know that against the 76ers. The big question is Gary Trent Jr. going to be consistent? I'll let you take it here, and I want to ask you, how do you think he's going to be performing? Are we going to get the Gary Trent Jr. that's going to consistently score 20, 25 points, or is he going to go 1 for 9? 5 for 18 from the field? Which Gary Trent Jr. are we going to see this playoff?
I don't remember the exact statistic, but I remember seeing it the other day of like Gary Trent Jr., the road warrior, and just some of the got like better numbers that he's had on the road. So I do completely agree with you that I think Gary Trent Jr. is probably one of the biggest X factors in this series because, as you said, Fred VanVleet, as much as he's playing through it and he's doing his best, like that injury, you can tell has definitely taken its toll in the second half of the season, and he just hasn't been the same Fred as the Fred VanVleet that was an all-star, about halfway through this season. So with that being said, Gary Trent Jr. is going to need to find scoring, and he's going to need to, in particular, not even just the 3-point not even just the 3-point shot, but I think just his shot making overall, like in terms of just off the dribble and like pulling up in space, getting his mid-range shots to drop. I think that's going to be such a huge thing for the Raptors here. And do I think he can do it? You know what? Like I actually, as far as Philly's personnel goes, like I think Gary Trent Jr. can definitely exploit the matchup again. Like the best perimeter guy that Philly has is Thibault, and Thibault is going to be missing time because he can't travel over to Toronto. So with that in mind, that's going to create opportunities for guys to get buckets on the perimeter. And I think that should be, if the green light isn't going off in Gary Trent Jr.'s head, I don't know why it wouldn't be, because that should absolutely be the sign where he's like, okay, I can go and get mine, because Toby's not a great defender on the perimeter at all. James Harden is better when you bring him down low into the post, but on the perimeter, like you said, he's a little spotty. Past that, I don't know who you're realistically going to be asking to fill in for Thibault in those games. Is it going to be George Niang? Is it going to be Danny Green? Either way, I don't think you hate either of those matchups, in particular if it's Niang. Like he's not good defensively. In any case, like the Raptors are going to get their opportunities on the perimeter, I think for sure. And I think Gary Trent Jr. is a massive X factor. And I think, frankly, I could very much so anticipate maybe not like a massive series from him, but I do think he can score somewhere around that 20 points per game mark in this series. I think there's potential for him to exploit a lot of good opportunities here.
Yeah, I agree. It's great that you did mention that. I remember seeing that stat somewhere as well, where he performs, I think he was shooting somewhere like 10-15% better on the road as opposed to home, which is a little bit crazy to think, but I'm expecting big things from Gary Trent Jr. as well.
I have a theory. Yes. Hear me out. I think the Raptors are honestly as good of a road team as they are because they spent an entire season in Tampa Bay, just playing essentially the entire season on the road. So I think honestly, like that's an environment where I'd like to think that they thrive. Okay, I am going to do a quick fact check because now I'm just curious, like what the Raptors' road record is. I think I remember
24 and 17.
Okay, I can't trust if it's the exact same one as their home record. Yeah, 24 and 17. You're completely right. But like, I do think, mentally, just that season in Tampa, as much as we hate looking back on it, on top of the fact that it obviously got a Scotty Barnes, like mentally, they know what it's like to be on the road and they know what it's like to be hated and play like wherever they're playing. So, it could have instilled a little bit of that, road warrior mentality into this team. So I'm all for it. Right. No, at this point.
Absolutely. I think it's not only Gary Trent Jr., but also the Raptors as well. I think they got this mentality. I remember hearing Kyle Lowry, and I think it was similar in the sense that the Raptors played so much better when Kyle Lowry was on this team on the road than, opposed to home. It's that mentality, that us versus the world mentality. Of course, Toronto being the only Canadian team as well. So I think you really do have to take that into consideration, that the Raptors just have this mentality that it's going to be us and we're facing everyone here. So I think they really have that tough mentality where they're like, okay, we really got to lock things down and just play a lot better. And of course, that mentality has stuck with Gary Trent Jr. as well. So I expect big things from him the first two games. It'll be interesting again to see how the Raptors play, in particular the backcourt in Fred VanVleet, but especially Gary Trent Jr. on the home side as well. And of course, Matisse Thybulle will not be there. So it'll be fun to see that. I think Gary Trent Jr. ultimately will have a big series. So it's going to be exciting series. But let's get on to the predictions.
And speaking of us versus the world, yes, prediction time. So I know Mr. Shaquille O'Neal has already provided the Raptors with some bulletin board material saying that they are going to get swept in this series. I personally disagree, Mr. O'Neal, Mr. Shaq, Mr. Worst member of that cast. I'll say he's definitely the worst member of that crew. With all that being said, call me crazy, call me bold. I actually think the Raptors couldn't have asked for a better first round matchup. I think Philly, as far as everybody that you could have played from that top four, I know Philly has Embiid, and I know there's potential for Embiid, if he really catches fire, to exploit some things there. But other than that, Harden hasn't looked great. Like Maxey can have a good series. He's a very good player, but like a lot of the guys, it's a lot of question marks, with guys like Harden. What's Tyrese Maxey going to look like in this like extended look in the playoffs? Is Tobias Harris still really that good? Like there's a lot of just question marks. And as you touched upon earlier, like the Sixers aren't really that deep. Like they don't have a lot going for them because they surrendered a lot of that depth, when they went out and got James Harden. And
Mhm.
again, if this was the James Harden from a few years ago, I'd say that's worth it because Joel Embiid's going to be dropping like 30 and 15 while Harden's dropping like 30, 10 and 10. But it's not the same James Harden from a few years ago. And with all
Mhm.
that in mind, I'm going to say it. I'm going to say Toronto in 6. I think Toronto takes this series. Again, I don't think they could have asked for a better matchup. I think this is exactly where they want to be. They obviously won the regular season series against this team, although I never really like putting too much emphasis there. But I honestly think in an extended look with this team, there's way more going for the Raptors here than honestly there has any business being. And with that being said, yeah, I think Toronto takes it. Am I a bit of a homer in making that prediction? Absolutely, but even still, I like them. I like them in the series. I like them a lot better here than I would have against any other team from that top 4. So I will absolutely take it, and I will absolutely say Raptors in 6.
Okay, first of all, you're not a homer. I think a lot of people are sleeping on the Raptors and what they're able to do in terms of their starting five. I think it was the score that had just posted that this morning, where it was the third straight season where the Raptors have 5 players that are averaging 15 plus points. And
Yeah.
many people have talked about this. Come playoff time, you need your starters to play heavy minutes. So you're going to have no problem. Each of their players, their starters, are going to have no problem dropping a lot of points. So I think it's not a far stretch to say the Raptors have this series. And I think people are, I wouldn't say they're sleeping. I would say Raptors fans are sleeping in terms of how competitive this series is still going to be. Even though I actually do have the Raptors in 6 as well, I think those are going to be some really close games as well. We think alike, good minds think alike, but I think it's not going to be blowout games. It's the playoffs. It's going to be a lot closer. They're a good defensive team as well as we are. And I was talking about these stats, JJ, in my video. But when you take a look at how many points the Raptors and the 76ers have scored and how many points they have allowed, they're very similar. I believe it's 109 points, and they allow around 106, 107 points each. So it's going to be a competitive series. It's going to be a fun series, but ultimately, I'm not being a homer. I'm being realistic here. I think the Raptors definitely take this. They have a lot of advantages coaching wise. It seems like we are in Joel Embiid's head because he's averaging for the last 2 seasons. And you got to remember, we had Aaron Baines last season, for crying out loud. He's averaging He's averaging 39% from the field against us the last 2 seasons. So even though he's getting his points, he's scoring 25, 30 points, gathering those, 11, 12 rebounds, we're still making him work from the field. So I think it's going to be a fun series, but ultimately I do have the Raptors in 6 as well.
Well, there you have it, folks. Me and the Waraich Report are both on the same page here. We got the Raptors in 6. I swear to God, we didn't even plan that out. So that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for joining me here today, Waraich. Obviously, it is always a pleasure. And again, folks, if you're still here with us at this point in the video, make sure you go check out his channel. I'm sure, honestly, if you're here on my channel, you probably already know who the Waraich Report is. But in case you don't, just make sure you head over there. He is fantastic, great at what he does, and unequivocally my favorite person to work with on YouTube.
Awesome.
So,
Thank you so much, AJ, for having me. And as always, you know what? It's so much fun talking about the Raptors. And of course, guys, make sure to like his channel. Make sure to subscribe. He's close to 1,000 subscribers. So let's get him there as soon as
180
possible.
left. 180
180.
left.
There you go, guys. There you go. One subscriber at a time. Let's get him to 1,000. And JJ, thank you so much for having me on. This was awesome and a lot of fun to do.